Okay, so as mentioned in this part 4, we're going to take a closer look at my collection. So I gave this part a lot of thought. How do I want to go about doing this, getting into my collection? And I came up with kind of 3 things I want to do. So I'm going to start off by kind of giving some general remarks regarding my collection, kind of give an overview, if you will, of how I came to acquire the games I did and what that process has been like, and so on and so forth. And then in the second sort of section of this part 4, where I get into my collection, I'm going to discuss a couple of my favorite designers and show off, if you will, a couple of their games. And then also in that second section, I'm going to cover some other noteworthy games in my collection. So I basically went through all my various games, and I had to be kind of selective, right? Because this is already a long episode, so I couldn't pick too many, right? But I basically went through and sort of pulled certain games off the shelf that were noteworthy for various reasons. So again, we'll get into some of those games, and then we'll conclude this part by offering a video tour of my collection. And as we'll see, we've got games in various parts of the house that's happened over the years. They sort of start accumulating in various spots. My wife, of course, loves it, but that's the game plan for this part. Let's go ahead then and dive in. And first I want to start by offering some general remarks about my collection. So again, I got into gaming about 15 years ago, and over that time, right? So we're going on almost a couple decades. My collection has grown and grown and grown. Of course, the space with the family and whatnot has kind of become less and less and less, and so those two things, at some point, right, that was going to become an issue, and that's happened here in recent years. So I'll get more into that here in a moment. But I have been sort of growing the collection. It started when I started playing Settlers of Catan. I picked up a few games at that point, including Settlers of Catan. Was one of the first ones I actually purchased, and then steadily I've been acquiring more and more games up to this point. So I literally have over 800 games at this point in the collection. So how did I go about acquiring these games? I talked a little bit about how long I've been acquiring them for. How did I go about doing it? That's been interesting in itself. At first, when I first got into gaming, way at the beginning, I was, just in love with the hobby and kind of blinded by this new obsession. And I just wanted to try whatever I can get my hands on. And so my strategy with respect to strategy board games at the time was to get as many as I could, right? And to try as many things out as possible. So at that point, back then, I was all about sales, right? At the very beginning, a couple good friends and myself, we bought, a couple games, Settlers of Catan, Agricola, and a couple others from our friendly local gaming store. I should throw that in there. But very shortly after that, I would check out the sales. This is what I was getting into, of online vendors. And, when they would have sales, of course, that happened at various times of the year and generally with respect to holidays. But whenever they'd have sales, I would jump on those and, get a bunch at a time. And I remember at the time I'd go on Board Game Geek and try to solicit feedback and recommendations from other board game geeks on the site. And I'd say, I'm choosing from all these various ones I have. My budget's X amount. Which ones would you take? And I remember some users commenting, well, these all, they're okay, but there's no really good games. Why don't you instead, put your money towards a few less games, but that are really good? And my take, as I mentioned at the time, is I can appreciate that opinion, but, at this stage, I'd rather, with the same amount of money, be able to become exposed to more of the games, right? And take on more themes and more mechanics and so on. So again, I could appreciate both sides at the time. And what's interesting is at that time, when my collection wasn't that large, I could afford, both monetarily and in terms of space especially, to go ahead and buy games in bulk, right? But what's interesting then is over time, again, as the space has become more and more of an issue, the strategies had to change. I guess it's maybe a tactical move on my part, right? I've had to adjust and become much more choosy as time has gone along here. And in fact, it's come to the point where I'm having to, my mother she has plenty of space. She lives on her own, and there's storage there. And in fact, there's unused shelves. And so I've started moving some of the collection to her house. Again, we have 4 kids, and they acquire more and more stuff as well. We're just sort of maxed in terms of what we can fit here anymore. So I've been forced as a result of that to in some sense downsize. So not only can I not keep buying more and more in bulk, I have to, if I do buy games, I kind of have to pick a few then to demote, so to speak, or move to my mother's house. And I shouldn't say they're not like the worst of my collection that I moved there. We like having various games there. It's nice to have a part of the collection there. When we visit, we can pull out games as well. And the whole plan then is down the road when the kids move out, I don't want to get rid of the games. I actually like all the games in my collection and having all of them. We'll probably turn, if I have my way at least, who knows what my wife would say, but I envision turning one of the rooms into a gaming room, right? And then getting all my games back, having a nice library of games, with all the games in one room, whereas right now they're scattered all over, including at different properties, right? So it's been interesting, again, how the process of acquiring my games has changed over the years, and sort of how my strategies has had to change as well. My strategy has had to change. So I've gone from, I mentioned, initially ordering in bulk from online vendors, particularly when they had sales, to scaling it way back and being much more choosy. And so one thing we've started doing a lot that I've done, I don't even remember the last time I actually ordered online from a vendor. Occasionally if I see a game fairly cheap on Amazon or Target, I might pull the trigger on it. But actually where I tend to acquire most of my games in the last few years is from half-price books. Surprisingly, they actually have a nice selection of used board games often, and sometimes new ones. And with my teacher's discount, we actually get 10% off. So my kids, not only do I enjoy books, but obviously, if you're familiar with my channel, I love I love books as well. So not only do I love board games, but I love books, as do my kids. So we all loved going to half-price books, and that's actually where I've acquired most of the games that I picked up in recent years. So that's been the newest sort of trend for us. But again, even then, I have to be and it's hard because every time we go, there'll be some new stuff there. Oftentimes, games I've never even heard of and that are highly ranked, and it's hard for me to say no to those kinds of games. But that I've been forced, again, given these practical considerations, to do just that, to be much more choosy. But I do plan, like I said, to once the kids are out, or at least the oldest, convert, or the oldest 2 probably, once they're both out, then convert one of their rooms then into a gaming room. At least that's how I see things happening. As I mentioned, who knows what my wife has in mind. Couple interesting tidbits as well here that I'll throw in. One thing that I'm kind of a stat nerd, as I've mentioned. So one quirky thing that we do, that again I had kind of initiated, was we like to keep track of all the times we played the games. I used to do that on Board Game Geek, but that's just too tedious to go online and have to enter all those when we play so many. But we'll keep a piece of paper in pretty much every game, every box of a game that we play, and we'll write down the date after we play. We'll write down the date and what everybody's score was, just so we can kind of have a record of it. Again, I'm a kind of a stat nerd, so not that other gamers do this necessarily, but it's kind of one thing that we do as well, and my kids enjoy as looking back as well, and on how we've done over the months, over the years, playing the same game. That's kind of fun. Also, being the stat nerd I am, I've mentioned Board Game Geek quite often. I've mentioned how there's ratings, and you can go on there and rate the games, and then use those ratings to see all the geeks or the users on there are free to rate these various games, and then you can use the average rating to kind of affect your to factor into your decisions. And so I like rating the games as well. Just throwing out some numbers, I went and looked at my profile. So as of today, I had rated 438 games. So my collection's actually much higher than that. I rated games not only that were necessarily, they didn't necessarily have to be in my collection for me to rate them. Maybe I'd played somebody else's game, right? But I always play them at least a few times, usually before I rate them. Maybe I played them online, but don't own a copy myself, right? That might be the case. But one way or another, I rated 438 games, with my average rating being, for what it's worth, right? How many of you actually care? Who knows? 6.37 is my average rating. So as I like to tell my kids, sometimes I like to ask them after we play a new game, what's your rating? And as I always mention to them, I'm a difficult grader, so to speak, when it comes to these games. So my average rating, or at least I think so, is a 6.37. A lot of times you'll see people's average ratings being 7 or 8 or whatever. But just throwing that out there for what it's worth. My highest rated game is by, again, my favorite designer, Wolfgang Kramer, and Michael Kiesling, and that's Torres. That rates a 9.3 for me. I checked, and I had 6 games out of the 438 that were rated that were a 9 or higher, so not many. And then I went to the lower end of the scale, and the lowest I had was the lowest you can rate, at least. I guess I'm not sure if you can rate below a 1, but that's the lowest rating I give. And I gave 2 games a 1, tic-tac-toe, and Chutes and Ladders. So I'd mentioned Chutes and Ladders before, as a game I'm not a big fan of. Absolutely, no decisions. You go to where the space it says, and then a lot of times you might, it's been a long time since I played, but as I recall, you could be almost, there to win, and then just because of what you spun, right, have to go all the way back or significantly back. Not a fan of that sort of game. Hate tic-tac-toe. When we go to a restaurant, a lot of times on the piece of paper, for the kids, they'll have various games, and one's tic-tac-toe, and inevitably one of them will still ask to play, the youngest typically, and I'll just grit my teeth when that happens because I'm not a fan of tic-tac-toe. Anyway, so those are some nerdy sort of things. So that's kind of some general remarks. I'll move on now to discuss, as I intimated earlier, a couple of my favorite designers. I've already mentioned one, Wolfgang Kramer, but then I'll also discuss Richard Garfield, who I would consider probably, those two are probably my favorite designers. I'd say Wolfgang Kramer is slightly above if I had to choose, but they're both, I have a lot of respect for both of them. And then I'll get into, again, some of my more noteworthy games in my collection. I can't, right, show them all off, but we'll go through some of them that stood out for various reasons. So that's the game plan here in the second section. First, I'll start with Wolfgang Kramer. I already mentioned Torres in previous parts as well. That's my most highly rated game. Love the balance of the gameplay. Love the simplicity of the rule set, and yet the depth that the rules afford nonetheless, right? That's just gameplay elegance to me. That's just, it really hits the sweet spot in terms of being really easy to learn and teach, and yet at the same time, be really hard to master in some sense. You're always learning, as I mentioned in previous parts, or you're always learning more and more, even literally hundreds of games in. I was still seeing different play styles that were effective when I was initially playing this online. So love that game. I have all sorts of his games in my collection, and you're gonna have to excuse me. I got games all over here, so I'll be tossing games aside here and there. I brought, I mentioned El Grande before. This is one of his that he is really highly rated as well. This is one of the first few that I added to the collection as well. It's a territory control game where you're trying to possess different areas that are worth various points, right? So you're kind of trying to get other players, right, out of these various areas that you're trying to control for these various points, and really clever mechanics in terms of how you get your guys out there, which are of course cubes on the board. But really like this one, and that's been in the collection for quite some time. That's El Grande. Again, I have a ton of his games, probably like 15 at least in the collection. Here's a random one that I pulled off the shelf that he did with Richard Ulrich. He oftentimes will team up with different designers. So here's a random one. And then I wanted to show off Tikal as well. This is a really cool, show off the back of the board. I won't necessarily open it up, but really cool thematic game that I played very early on. It was one of my initial board game acquisitions, the physical copy, but I also played online a long time ago, and so played this one a lot. So I have fond memories when I was first getting into gaming of playing this one. It's fairly easy, so it almost is a gateway game. I can't remember. Yes, it was Spiel des Jahres, the winner. So Right here. A lot of these games, actually, or at least some of them, you'll notice as we go through them, were Spiel des Jahres winners. So that's the major, most highly coveted board game award they hand out every year. And to win that particular award, the major one, Spiel des Jahres, it can't be a super long game. It has to have fairly wide appeal and be fairly accessible to, it can't just be a niche crowd. It has to have some general appeal. And it's a big deal if you win. And so this was a one in 1999, so that's when it was published. I like, again, the theme. You're exploring a jungle, exploring different temples and treasures. Really cool game that he did. One of the more highly rated games, again, and one of the first few that I explored. So, again, that's Wolfgang Kramer. The thing I really appreciate about him or that stands out is, again, the balance of his games. So there's lots of different strategies you can typically explore in his games, and the gameplay and mechanics are very well balanced. So I haven't really encountered a Wolfgang Kramer game that I don't like. Another one that stands out that I don't actually have the physical copy that I played a lot online is Hacienda. Love that game as well. That's another one of his. But they typically play in under an hour is another nice thing. So love the gameplay. Typically short and sweet rule set, but that admits a lot of depth. So those are the kinds of things that really stand out to me about Mr. Kramer and why I like his games. Mentioned Richard Garfield. So he's the other kind of designer, as I was thinking about it, that I would say I have the most respect for. So this was hard. Rudiger Dorn is another great designer. There was all kinds of them. Who's the guy that did, I'll mention Transforming Mars here in a bit, Jacob Firaxolis. I'm not sure how to say your name, Jacob. The guy that designed Terraforming Mars, great game. So picking my favorite designers was not an easy task, but I would have to say Richard Garfield's in that sort of top tier. And, sort of general reasons. I mentioned why I like Wolfgang Kramer. What stands out about Garfield's games? They're all unique. They seem to have like different themes, and the gameplay and the mechanics are very innovative. And so I'll just throw out there right off the bat a game that a lot of you guys have probably heard of that will testify to his talent and the uniqueness of his designs, and that's Magic the Gathering. Richard Garfield's the designer of that. So that goes, I want to say early 90s. I actually don't remember when it was initially published or designed by him, but it goes way back. Every year, if you're not familiar, every year they're still producing Magic the Gathering cards. So, Garfield, that really was his claim to fame. I remember when I was growing up, there were not only gaming stores, but actually stores specifically for Magic the Gathering. That's how big it was. In case I guess you're not as familiar with it nowadays, but you can go online. We bought 1,000 random assorted Magic the Gathering cards here. They send it to you in a box. I'm not going to get into the gameplay, but that's a great game. I played it online implementations, various electronic implementations, but then I have the physical copy as well. My son really likes the game, so that's one that I wanted to mention here at the outset. Magic the Gathering, probably his most well-known game, but I love a lot of his different designs. So another one I would mention is King of Tokyo. This, in my mind, it's not as good as Magic the Gathering. There's very few games in my mind that are as good as Magic the Gathering, but King of Tokyo is awesome as well. It's so good, in fact, that I have a couple different versions of it. They released a newer version that has an additional game mechanic here in the last year or two. This was the original version, and we have all the expansions and so on. The awesome thing about King of Tokyo, again, totally different sort of gameplay than, say, Magic the Gathering. What I like about it is you're playing with these, awesome monsters. You're trying to attack each other, but it's all in fun, and there's these quirky, interesting sort of adaptations you can acquire for your monsters, and it's quick gameplay. And the other thing that I really like about not only King of Tokyo from Garfield, but a lot of his games, the thing that stands out in general is that they have wide appeal and they're pretty accessible, right? So King of Tokyo is a great example. Kids love it, but then it's fairly easy and straightforward, and there's enough strategy involved that adults can play it and have fun as well. And not only that, but whether they're gamers or non-gamers. So we've played King of Tokyo with the grandparents who, they don't play these strategy games. for the most part, but they played King of Tokyo with myself and my kids. So that's another thing that really stands out about Richard Garfield's designs is that they tend to be, and they play really quick, typically. Very unique, play quick, and have a wide appeal, or tend to be accessible to a large audience. Probably larger audience than most strategy games, I'd say. Which other one? Oh, so I wanted to mention Bunny Kingdom's another one of his recent designs. It's kind of a step up in terms of complexity. It would maybe be like not a gateway game, but the next step, maybe. My third born, second youngest, she loves bunnies, and so this was an instant buy when it came out, maybe 3 years ago. And it's got, again, really clever gameplay mechanics. Won't get into it too much, but we played this one a ton over the years. So that's Bunny Kingdom, another one of his, Richard Garfield's really good designs. I think that's, and we have, plenty more of Garfield's designs that I didn't get into that are arguably just as good, right? But again, I wanted to get into some other games as well. So those are I would suggest probably my two favorite designers for what it's worth. Now I wanted to get into some other games that seem noteworthy for various reasons. So let's go ahead and do that. I won't spend too much time on Settlers of Catan because we've already talked about that, and really I've already mentioned why it's significant or noteworthy. And that's because it's really the first game that got me started, right? That opened my eyes to the world of strategy board games, to the very notion that these kinds of games existed, right? So have to pay again a debt of gratitude to Settlers of Catan, although I don't play it nearly as often as I used to. Okay. Another game, so various games, different reasons to point them out. This is going to be one that might be a little more difficult to get to, but here is, so I thought, well, I better show them my most highly rated game. I mentioned how you can get on Board Game Geek, right, and rate all these games. And so I went into the collection and looked up what game do I possess that has the highest Board Game Geek rating. I have the number 4 game on Board Game Geek, at least as of now, end of July in 2022, and that's Gloomhaven Jaws of the Lion. I actually haven't played this yet. This is a perfect example of one of the games I come across at Half Price Bookstore, where I'm like, what's this one? I look into it. It's described as, it's a fully cooperative fantasy campaign adventure. So the idea is you don't just play it once, but it's a campaign, so you'll play it several times. So you have to kind of keep that in mind, right? You have to have the same group of players and bring them back and to play the campaign. But anyway, perfect example of the type of game where I wasn't that familiar with it, stumbled upon it at Half Price Bookstore, looked into it, I'm like, it was a great deal, and didn't realize, really that it even existed, and then it was the 4th highest game, rated game. So there it is, number 4, the most highly rated game in my collection. Having said that, what game I mentioned, all right, I haven't played that one. I just picked it up recently. What, is the game I have that's most highly rated that I have played? I've alluded to this one earlier when I was trying to figure out what the designer's name is, and that is Terraforming Mars. So I want to mention Terraforming Mars. This is one of my favorite games of all time. This is one of the 6 that is a 9 or higher, and I can't remember if it was a 9 or 9.1, what exactly I gave it, not that it matters. But Terraforming Mars, this is noteworthy, again, because it's according to Board Game Geek, in my collection, it's the 2nd highest rated game I have. And I also rated it very highly. So very noteworthy. And on top of that, this was last year's Hotness. So one of the terms you'll come across on Board Game Geek, if you explore it, is the Hotness. And that just basically means like what game or games you've been really into, or you could be a designer, who have you been exploring recently. So the Hotness for me last summer was this game. So I played it some with my son, but what was really great about this game, at least last summer when I had it out pretty much for a month at a time, I would play it almost every day. What was really good is its solo versions. There's actually a few different variants. I ended up picking up all the different expansions for it. Right, we had Colonies, Venus, which we terraform as well with Venus Next. Turmoil, which is like adding a political aspect to the regular gameplay. Prelude, which is the first thing that came out that kind of gives you a little boost at the beginning. Basically, the idea is you're running a corporation, and you're competing with the other players, or that kind of changes in the solo variant. But the idea is, in general, you're running a corporation in an attempt to terraform Mars, and it's again one of those games that's very educational because a lot of how it works and the mechanics are based on the reality of the situation and needing to have a certain temperature, a certain amount of oxygen on the planet, and so on. You have to have a certain temperature, a certain oxygen level, and then a certain number of oceans or water tiles placed on the board to then trigger the end. Right? And the whole idea is, well, that's representative of what would actually be necessary to terraform and inhabit Mars. So I really like that, and they talk about how the research that went into the game and so on and so forth. So love the thematic and educational elements of this game, but on top of that, love the solo variants, and they wouldn't work. The game wouldn't be any good if the gameplay itself and the mechanics weren't great, and that's the thing that really stands out as well. Great theme, but also incredibly well designed. It's extremely well balanced, especially given all the cards and variables that are at play given all these different cards. Love this game. Here's a look at the back, and somehow I did manage to get this is extremely heavy because I put all of these are actually empty. I put all the expansions, somehow managed to get them in here. So that was last summer's hotness, so to speak. One thing that, while I'm talking about Terraforming Mars, and I mentioned how much I loved it, but as you acquire games and pick up games, one thing you might have to deal with is a game that is missing components, or maybe something's off. And so at various times I've had to contact publishers, right, when something was a foul or a miss. And that happened with respect to Venus Next. The cards were noticeably different than all the others. So just to throw that out there too, that as you sort of put together your collection, you might encounter these various situations, and it's annoying, but they're typically handled eventually, right? So I remember there was quite a process. People weren't happy because obviously it wasn't just my copy; it was a copy, or it was an issue for the first print run, I believe. So anybody that got a copy from the first print run encountered the same issue. But they did eventually, right, cards that were the same as the others, and they replaced everybody's copy. So I eventually did get replacement cards. As I mentioned, eventually, I've never had a situation that wasn't eventually worked out. But there's been some very aggravating situations. One time I got a game where the components actually had mold all over them, and so it took forever for somebody in that instance. I'm not going to name the name of the company, but it took forever for them to even respond to me. By that point, I had cleaned off all the components myself because I didn't want to be dealing with mold. And they eventually sent replacement parts, but it literally took months. And as I said, I had to invest a lot of my time anyway to clean up the components as well. So that was one of the more annoying situations. Just not a big deal, right? First world problems, but something that you might come across if you do get into gaming and start buying quite a few games. Okay, so that was Terraforming Mars. Another game I have to say something about is Seven Wonders. So I think I alluded to this when I was talking about gameplay mechanics, right? Card drafting. So this game, I can't remember when it came out. It seems to me like this should have won Game of the Year. Maybe it didn't. It won some other game, it looks like. This is an extremely highly rated and popular game. The nice thing about it is it's got that sense of building a civilization, but a lot of civilization building games are notorious for taking a lot of time. Not the case here. As the box says, it plays in 30 minutes or less if people know what they're doing. And the reason, and it doesn't really, a lot of times when you add players, it's going to add to the game time, but that's not the case with Seven Wonders because a lot of what you're doing, you do simultaneously, right? You're all picking a card from hands at the same time and then passing them around. Then you take your actions basically at the same time. So games go by quick, even if you're playing with a large player count. So that's one thing that stands out about Seven Wonders. But it's very dynamic, very highly rated game. Seven Wonders, very quick and easy to teach. I haven't met too many people that don't like it. So had to give this a mention. And another reason to mention it is because it produced or spawned like sort of a family of various games. So the regular Seven Wonders has 2, 3, or 4 expansions. I picked up, I think this is the latest one, Babel, and it's got actually 2 sort of expansions within it that you can add one or both to the regular gameplay or the other expansions as well. So when you really, I mentioned, I think, like the big box in an earlier part and expansions. So basically the idea with expansions, if it wasn't clear up to this point, is you like the base game, the regular game, or if, I should say, if a game does well, if it's successful, oftentimes then they'll add expansions, which add different sort of mechanics to the gameplay in one way or another, right? So there's all sorts of different ways that expansions can work. Some expansions are good. They really add to the base game. Sometimes they add a lot of bloat and are more trouble than they're worth and maybe add undue complexity. So expansions, in my experience, and most gamers I think would acknowledge, are kind of hit and miss. It just depends. Again, a lot of times I think this is a great expansion, but some people, they might not be big fans of it. But not only so did the original Seven Wonders spawn various expansions, but then they came out with Seven Wonders Duel, which apparently did not win Spiel des Jahres either, but it did win all sorts of different awards. This is actually even higher, rated even higher on Board Game Geek than the original Seven Wonders. It's a 2-player version of Seven Wonders. It captures a lot of the same things that are going on from the original Seven Wonders, but again, it's a 2-player, specifically 2-player version, and there's still unique things going on that separate it from the original, and it's, again, arguably even better. So, love this one as well. Expansions for it, I picked up Agora, which I really like. That's one of 2 or 3 expansions that they have for Duel. And then one thing that's really cool about Seven Wonders Duel is they have then made the authors, actually, so this is officially approved and sort of put out, solo variant. They've offered Seven Wonders Duel solo variant, which you can then go and sort of print off these extra components. It's free to print off the extra components, and they provide the designers themselves provided the solo rules in, and I've loved that. That's actually been the hotness for me recently. I took this. The nice thing about Seven Wonders Duel is you can take it anywhere, right? Look how small it is. Took this on our trips out to Colorado recently and played several games of the solo variant, and it did a great job of capturing the gameplay of the regular gameplay with 2 players, right? And you can go up against Caesar and Aristotle and all these various leaders in the solo variant. So love that. Wanted to mention that as well. So that's sort of the Seven Wonders family. Great family of games, if you will, with lots of different ways to play. Again, that's Seven Wonders. Speaking of solo play, so I mentioned the solo variant there. I wanted to mention here another recent pickup. This is Friday. So I mentioned Power Grid, I think, in the previous part of the episode. And the designer here, this is another prolific designer, Fredman Fries. I don't know if I actually said his name right. Almost all of his games start with F. Power Grid obviously doesn't, and some of that was lost in translation. He's actually German. I believe all the games in the original, his original language, which is German, start with an F, as does his name. But he's also a big fan of green, so his hair is green, all his boxes are green, and so on. But this is what's unique about Friday, and why I'm bringing it up, is that it's specifically designed as a solo game. And I guess another one that I just thought of is Honorim. That's another really good game that's designed to be solo, although I guess it can be played actually with more players. So I take that back. This one literally is designed for 1 player, right? It is a solo adventure, which is extremely highly rated. It's amazing what he packed into this little game. It's actually a deck builder. So you start off with a certain number of cards. I think it's 18, and they're all pretty bad. And so as the game progresses, you're trying to get rid of those original cards in your deck and acquire better cards to make your deck better. Right? That's the sense in which it's a deck builder. But does a great job. It's very challenging. I still haven't beat it, even on level 1. I just started, as I mentioned, I just picked it up. So that's Friday. Another game I wanted to talk a little bit about. A couple noteworthy things to say with respect to it is survive. First of all, one thing that's kind of stands out to me about Survive is how long ago it was designed. I want to say in the early 80s, maybe like 1981 even. So it's been around for many decades. So that's something that stands out because most designer European or Euro strategy board games are a much more recent phenomenon. I would say maybe the late 90s and beyond that. So at least, obviously there were games that were designed back then, but not near as many, and very few have stood the test of time, are still being published as Survive is. Right? I guess that's the point. So that's very significant or noteworthy about Survive. Another thing I guess I would say is that really stands out is how much fun we've had. It's a family game. Definitely, I would say a gateway game. Right? It's easy enough to play. There's only like 3 parts to your turn. And it's thematic. It's fun to get. It's easy to get immersed in. So the gist of it is you're all on this island that's kind of slowly with each turn collapsing into the sea, and you need to get your particular dudes or dudettes from that island that's sinking onto the safe areas at the corners of the board. Meanwhile, you have monsters and sharks and whales and so on that you have to try to avoid and try to get on boats, and there's sort of some cooperative elements involved because you might not be on the same boat as some other players and their dudes or dudettes, and so who gets to control the boat? Well, whoever has the most dudes or dudettes on the boat. And so there's interesting gameplay elements. There's a reason why it stood the test of time. It's thematic. The theme appeals to a lot of people. I guess as long as you're okay with trying to get the other players' dudes and dudettes eaten by monsters and so on, right? A lot of your dudes and dudettes are going to die. So as long as you're okay with that, it's a great family game, a great gateway game, I would say. That's Survive. Another one I wanted to discuss, where is it? All the way at the bottom, of course, is Zooloretto. So here we have another Spiel des Jahres winner. This one was the 2007 winner. I have to mention Zooloretto because it is probably received out of all the games in my collection, right? As a result of being a family man and having four kids, it has probably received the most playtime of any of the games. And that's by virtue of the fact that every one of my kids has loved this game, right? It's one of the most requested, especially early on. The gameplay is simple enough that little kids could play. I mean, honestly, I think my kids played it at 5 years old, if not even 4. That's obviously going to be a challenge if they're that young. But the point is, the gameplay is simple enough that young kids can pick it up and they look at the game, right? The theme, I should say. It's all about getting animals and making your own zoo. Every kid loves that idea, and many adults do too. So another one of those games where it has wide appeal. Hence, it's no surprise that it won Spiel des Jahres. The kids are all going to love it, and it's got enough strategy, enough choices involved that parents won't mind playing either, even gamer parents. So Zooloretto had a ton of time, play time for us. We still play it occasionally. My youngest is 7. She still requests it. So if I were to say, pick one game, if you're just getting into games or this sounds interesting and you have a family and want to sort of get a game maybe for the family, Zooloretto definitely would be one of my top recommendations. I don't know how easy it is to come across a copy at this point. Surely, given the appeal, the fact that it was a Spiel des Jahres winner, you can get a copy. Highly recommended if that's your situation, or if the theme just sounds appealing to you. It's a solid game. Another family, I don't know if it's family necessarily, but a game that has spawned expansions, let's put it that way, that we've gotten into and played over the years. Did I bring in? I guess I didn't bring in the third box. I thought I did. Did I not bring in the bigger box? I thought I did, but so here's the original one. Then they had the big expansion, and then they had, here it is, another big expansion. And there might even be a bigger expansion. So I'm not sure if we have all the expansions or just 2 out of 3. Anyway, you can tell we've enjoyed this game, particularly my son. First thing I guess I would say, other than we got into the expansions and then it has expansions, is that this is one of the first ones that I added to my collection. So another noteworthy thing about it, The other really cool thing about this game is the theme and what you're doing. You're putting together. It's kind of the gameplay consists of two different parts, right? Part one, there's like 3 or 4 rounds. The first part of each round, you're putting together. There's three. I think there's 3 rounds. You put together your spaceship, which is really cool. It's this real-time deal where everybody's reaching in, getting components at the same time, and trying to add various components to their spaceship. And you're building a spaceship. Those components might be like batteries to power up various parts of your spaceship, or they might be laser guns, right? You might try to boost your strength, or they might be what do they call them? Like places where hubs where your people can be, so you can get more guys or girls on your ship. So you're building your ship, and then part two of each round, you're sending that ship on an excursion, on an adventure, as are all the other players with their ships, and you encounter all these foes, and you hope to make it to the end without your ship falling to pieces. So you're going to encounter battles and so on. Really cool theme, a lot going on, especially if you add in the expansions. It can be pretty, take a relatively simple game and make it much more complex. So this might be an example in my mind where if you add all the expansions, it can be too much. But we got into it, and my son loved it. He actually is the one who acquired the expansions. Oops. Is the one that acquired the expansions. Obviously, we played this one a lot. Really like it. If the theme sounds appealing at all, definitely worth your while to pick this one up. I don't know how to say the guy's name. This is another very well-known designer, Vlaada Chvátil. He's created a ton of different games. In fact, I have many in my collection. This is probably our favorite by him, but wanted to mention again that he's one of those designers that's up there in terms of the tiers. Didn't quite make tier 1 for me, but very noteworthy designer. That's Galaxy Trucker. Then I wanted to talk briefly about Raw. Speaking of a really well-known designer, Reiner Knizia, arguably out of all these designers, he might be the most well-known. They call him Dr. Knizia. I don't know. Again, another guy, I don't know how to say his name. I believe he has a PhD in mathematics. So needless to say, his games are very well designed, are very well balanced. They tend to be on the quicker end of the spectrum. He's won many Spiel des Jahres awards. He has a lot of super popular games. In fact, he might be the one that I have the most games by out of all the designers, him or Kramer probably. So I have a ton of his designs. Another very popular designer, very well known, maybe even arguably, again, the most well known. Now, the reason why, though, none of that's why I wanted to bring this up. The reason why I bring it up is because this is the one my dad loves to play, and that we've played a lot with extended family when we go up to Nebraska and get together over Christmas and so on. Raw comes out. My dad, this is in fact probably the only game he'll really play in terms of strategy board games. He really likes it. We played it so much that I almost grew tired of. I did grow tired of it for a while, to the point where I didn't even want to play it. And it's a really good game, really well designed. Not true anymore. I'm willing to play it now because we took some time off from it. But great game, very easy to teach. Again, this is the case with most of his games. Plays relatively quickly. It's an auction game, so depending on what's out there, that's another type of gameplay mechanic, right? Depending on what's out there, you might want to bid a little bit more, right? And depending on what other people have bid, how high do you want to bid? So you're bidding with these suns, which have different values on them, right? How do you want to put your high-numbered or high-valued sun out there because the stuff's really good, or do you want to try to wait and see if it comes back around you and is even better, right? So those are the kinds of choices you have to make, and it's an auction game, and I tend to like auction games, actually, and so it's no surprise that I like Raw as well. I made it sound like, I really grew to despise this game. That's not the case. We've played it a ton, and I do enjoy it. It's a good game, very good auction game, I would say. Okay, then the last one, well, a couple more here. One of the ones I wanted to mention would be Smash Up. So this is one where sometimes there's discussions of whether a game's fiddly, and what that means is there's a lot of stuff to keep track of, maybe a lot of components, a lot of calculations. And when I first started playing Smash Up, that was my immediate sentiment, that you have all these bases out there, and then you're placing different dudes on these different bases, and so are all the other players. And they have all kinds of different effects which are then affecting one another, and so on. It's like, that was my immediate reaction. But over the years, the theme is really good, and over the years, you sort of learn, you catch on how to make the calculations a little quicker and so on. The point is, over the years, it kind of grew on me. I still think it's true that some of that calculation can be tedious, but Smash Up is a game that my rating of it has gone slightly up over the years. And for a while there, we played it so much so the kids really like it. That was another reason why I'm bringing it up here and why we played it so much. For a while there, we picked up every expansion that was coming out. Now, the last 3 or 4 years, that's not been the case. But we had to, we have all the various expansion boxes. You could get the big geeky box, which came with a few unique things and then gives you a lot more space to put all basically it's a card game, really. Every component is, if I recall, is a card. So you can keep everything right in this nice, neat box. This is a very heavy box because we have a ton in here. But what's cool and unique about this game, as the name implies, is every game you're going to take 2 different, I think they're called factions, 2 different groups, and all these groups are types of things: grandmas, aliens, dinosaurs. These are just examples. All of them have a deck of 20. You're going to take 2 of these factions and smash them up before the game, basically shuffle them together, and that's your combo then, and you're going to take on all the other players who are doing the same thing. So you can have really cool combinations: dinosaur grandmas, dinosaur aliens, dinosaur rock stars, ant spiders. They have had all kinds of things over the years. So cool concept, cool theme. Gameplay is pretty simple, but is it fiddly? There's an argument for that, I think. A lot of calculations involved, but anyway, this might be an example of another gateway game. I'm not sure with, again, the calculations, but a lot of people consider it a gateway game. So that is Smash Up. I guess the last couple games I'd mention is the recent hotness for us. And what I mean by that, again, hotness is what's been hot around these parts, so to speak, right? What games have been reaching the table. And those would be, recently for us, again, a lot of it's dictated by being with my kids, especially over the summer when they're at home throughout the day. 2 games that really stand out that we just picked up pretty recently: Point Salad and Just One. So I'll talk very briefly about each one of these in turn. Let's start with Just One. Actually, a Spiel des Jahres winner, Game of the Year 2019. So we have another one. This gameplay is so simple that I'll actually explain it. And in fact, it seems so simple that I couldn't really believe it was Game of the Year when I first sort of explored it. What's happening? What's unique about it is it's a cooperative game where you're trying to work together to get a certain score and then try to better your score. And so how it works is, and it's always 13 cards that you start with. So you take 13 of the cards. So you take 13, and then somebody starts. And so what they do is you draw from the deck, so your deck of 13, you put it on there, and then whoever drew the card, they say a number, one of the 5. And so let's say they said 3. So what happens then is everyone else has to write on their thing. They have a little marker. They have to write one word that will be offered as a clue then. Hopefully, we'll see here in a second if it is. They'll write down one word. All right, let's say we're doing this. I'm going to write down this one. Okay. So the catch is, though, let's say we're playing 4 players. So there's one person that drew it. The other 3, once everybody gets one word down, they don't share, right, until everyone's got one. Then they will reveal amongst themselves, not the person that has to guess here in a moment, right? They'll reveal amongst themselves the one word that they each put down. And if there's any that are the same, food might be too common, right? Somebody else might have put that. If that's the case, then if anything's duplicated, you got to put it face down. The person who has to guess, the catch is they won't be able to see that word then. So you want to come up, what's unique and interesting about it is you want to come up with a word that will clue the person in, but that's not going to be so obvious that other people are inclined to also put the same word, because then it'll just cancel out. But then there's like doublethink, right? Well, I'm not going to put it because somebody else is, but then maybe they're thinking the same thing, and so nobody ends up putting it, right? Lots of interesting psychological sorts of deals like that, I would say. And then make the game, after I played it, I'm like, oh, I see. there is, enough going on here where this game does seem pretty interesting. And again, we really enjoy it. Everyone, super simple to explain, as is the case. I literally just explained it in like 2 minutes, probably. As compared to, say, an in-depth war game that might take Axis and Allies. It took us 3 hours to learn and set up. Right? Super quick. You can see why then this won Game of the Year. Because there is, even though it's super simple gameplay, there's still some depth involved, and you have to do some thinking, come up with a word, again, that's going to be good, but not too good in some sense, right? So we've been enjoying Just One, and it's also compatible with a number, a nice variety of players. It plays 3 to 7. So the other one I'd mentioned, and so this obviously highly rated, another highly rated game that I came across at Half Price Bookstore, hadn't even heard of, looked it up. It was super cheap, sounded good to the kids, and super highly rated. Point Salad, and loved it. The kids loved it. We played it a ton here this summer, so I picked it up this summer. It's so easy that, again, I can give you an idea of how it works. Right? You take a certain number of cards out based on the number of players. There's 6 different vegetables involved, and what's interesting, so you'll have the same number of each of these 6 vegetables in play. So you take a certain number, equal number of each of the 6 vegetables out of play, depending on the number of players. And what's interesting is literally every card in the game, they're dual-sided, right? So it's carrot on one side, but then on the other, it offers a unique way of scoring. So throughout the game, you can, on your turn, super simple, you either take a card, a scoring card that is, there's 3 available, or you take one of the vegetables that's available down below in the market. And so you're either taking 1 point card or you're taking 2 vegetables. And so you're going to acquire point cards and vegetables throughout the game. And, at the end, you might have, let's say, 5 point cards and 12 vegetables in various sorts. Maybe you're not trying to get onions and you're trying to get lots of carrots. Because, for example, maybe you have this card. Well, actually, there's no minus for an onion, but maybe you have you're trying to avoid cabbages, right, and get lots of carrots. Because in this case, you're going to lose points for cabbages, but gain points for carrots. So again, another super simple game to learn, but a lot of depth, given all the scoring cards are unique. And, there's different ways to play. Do you try to just get tons of scoring cards? Well, you don't want to get too many because then you're not going to have any vegetables to garner the points from the scoring cards, right? Do you instead try to just get tons of vegetables and only a couple of the scoring cards? Well, if you don't get enough scoring cards, then you might have a ton of vegetables, but you're not generating points because you don't have enough point cards. I've seen a particular point card earn like 35 points. So a lot of them, you're happy to get, say, 10, right? So it's really, again, super simple gameplay, but tons of strategies you can explore nonetheless. So very compelling gameplay. Again, super easy and accessible to anyone. We brought this to a family reunion recently, and people enjoyed it there. So that's the recent hotness. Again, Just One and Point Salad. So here we've gone through, and I've given you a little spiel on a couple of my favorite designers and gone through and discussed some of the more noteworthy games in my collection. I want to end this part 4, where we're talking about my collection, by giving you a brief video tour of the collection, including at its various different locations. So why don't we go ahead and do that? Okay, so we'll start our exploration of the collection in the basement hallway, which is really where I started putting the collection together when I first started exploring strategy board games, 15 plus years ago. This is pretty much where the games were stored exclusively, and then, over the years, as the collection's gotten bigger, of course, I've had to move, and expand the locations I store them at. And this used to house my favorites, but that's kind of changed over the years. It's become more of a, where can I put this particular game? Where can it fit? As you can see by the fact that we have games stored from floor to ceiling. And here we move to my son's room. He has a couple shelves full of games, again, floor to ceiling. These games tend to be on the lighter end of the spectrum and tend to be oriented more towards a younger audience, in particular, themes that he finds appealing. So here's the other shelf in his room then. And Over the years, we've had to get really resourceful, and we're even keeping games in the utility room here. So in this case, we're stacking them from ceiling to floor. We have, again, 2 shelves full of games in the utility room here. Here we have, I mentioned the big boxes there. That's where I store a lot of those. And again, we have games all the way up to pretty much the ceiling. Then we'll end the tour by heading out to the garage, where I store a lot of the older games and the games I'm not as fond of, I'll be honest. And with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up this part 4, where we've taken a closer look at my collection. Now, at this point in this episode of Experimenting with Existence, as we take a closer look here at some pictures throughout the house of board games in various locations. In fact, I'm not sure there's a room in the house anymore that doesn't have a board game or two. But it occurred to me that, this episode, it's going on for quite some time, and that it would be best maybe to have it in 2 parts, or 2, not parts, I shouldn't use that word, but have 2 videos for it. So I'm going to wrap up the first video here. So this first video will be parts 1 through 4, and then the next video we'll go ahead and move on to parts 5 through 8. And so in part 5, I'll move on to a discussion of my designs. So I mentioned all along here that I've been designing strategy board games from the get-go since I started playing them. So again, I'll start talking a little bit more about my designs themselves.